right, guys, Don Ford here, Progressive Insider. Another big interview to bring to you. Shahid Buttar going against Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco, California. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing all right. I actually feel very lucky, especially when I talk to folks around the country and hear what they're going through. I feel very fortunate in a time like this.
I'm glad to hear that because in California, we're definitely getting aspects and benefits available to the federal government much more quickly than other parts of the country. And not to mention that your particular area was one of the first areas to initiate a proper lockdown. How has that affected you as a progressive candidate, though? I mean, we can't talk about progressive politics without talking about how COVID-19 has changed ground game. So what are you doing right now?
Yeah, it's shifted a lot. The ground game has shifted, particularly in terms of pushing us off the doors. We can't do events or mobilizations without putting people at risk, but there are other ways of reaching voters, and that's what we've been taking advantage of. We've been retooling our phone banking operation over the last month to enable greater scale and distribution in our voter outreach program. For the first month after the pandemic emerged, we really didn't do voter outreach at all. We really focused on mutual aid, responding to the needs of the community in the face of the shelter-in-place order. So, for the last several weeks, our volunteers and staff have been calling first our volunteers and supporters, and then San Francisco voters, just to make sure that everybody knew where they could get groceries delivered, where they could get a free meal, how they could qualify for benefits, making sure people knew that they weren't alone. And only in the last week have we turned our attention back to voter outreach at the scale that we plan to maintain between now and the election.
What's interesting about that is you're addressing something that I didn't actually think we'd touch on, but we talk about what's happened to COVID-19 on a lot of levels all over the place. And we talk about these peaks all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're describing is the San Francisco having locked down earlier and it established these measures more effectively is probably seeing their first peak tip. And that's why you're talking about being able to change from direct relief to actual voter outreach and engagement at that point. Would you say something like that is accurate?
Well, I can't really necessarily prognosticate as to which way the graph breaks in the future. I certainly hope we're at a peak and the rates all drop. We've fortunately had relatively low rates of both infection and fatality here. I've, on the one hand, been very proud of our local leadership in announcing an early shelter-in-place order, though local leaders, frankly, to some extent, snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, particularly by abandoning our unhoused population. And it took several weeks for Mayor London Breed to accept the idea of getting people into shelter. And then at that point, it was congregant shelter, contrary to all the public health guidance that we've heard. And then when infections were confirmed within the population of people who were held in congregant settings, she finally relented and used emergency powers to put people in hotel rooms. But still, that policy has yet to hit the ground. And we still have people that are very much at risk, precisely because the city government has not seen fit to ensure that our unhoused neighbors have access to shelter. One of the things, separate from the ground game, you asked me a minute ago how the pandemic has influenced our campaign. And another way outside the ground game that it's really influenced the campaign is by just transforming the context in which voters are evaluating what our campaign offers as an alternative to the incumbent, Nancy Pelosi. And so many aspects of our federal policy, from maintaining a predatory corporate healthcare system to in adopting and reinforcing the corporate globalization that's destroyed domestic manufacturing supply chains, so many different federal policies ducked into the punch of this pandemic and made the public health crisis worse than it needed to be. And I think the pandemic has made, in terms more forceful than I ever could, that universal health care is a public health imperative and that we are all ultimately in this together.
Couldn't agree with you more. I take it so far as that we need to nationalize Amazon. So that's like nationalized healthcare. Oh yeah, absolutely. Hospitals, pills, the whole thing. And Amazon. I'd be like, whoa, Amazon. I'm like, yeah, let's just take it all. No, I think what you're saying is really, really important. You also brought up another issue that I think people need to think about because even in San Francisco, where they have initiated these really strong policies, there's still these important issues falling through the gap, especially when we're dealing with the homeless population. In Nevada, we see them lined up in those squares in the shadows of those giant empty hotels with hearts in their lights. It's ridiculous how they're trying to protect capitalism. And then when we talk about that, your opponent is, again, like you mentioned, that the team rock star of that mentality. And I think this is, right now it draws such a line that even the people in San Francisco who are protecting their wealth to some degree are going to be able to see this is an issue especially with what's going on with the current bill. What do you think about the compromise bill that just went through with more money for corporations and nothing for people?
Yeah, at the end of the day, we see Congress legislating not as we would expect in a democracy on behalf of we the people of the United States, but unfortunately in a capitalocracy on behalf of Wall Street. And there's no single seat in the country that better represents that divergence from the interests of the district and that commitment to capital better than the one I'm running for. Nancy Pelosi represents a city in Washington, San Francisco, that is the site of the most severe local housing crisis in the country. And it's during her tenure that the federal investments in affordable housing have dried up. It's no surprise, frankly, that there is an affordable housing crisis here in San Francisco. And it also shouldn't surprise us that a wealthy landlord in Congress is not showing up for renter rights. And that's a perfect example of how our city's voice in Washington has long, unfortunately, stood for values that don't serve the city's interests. And San Francisco also is the city where the United Nations was founded. This is a city that is proudly committed to human rights and immigrant rights. And Nancy Pelosi, unfortunately, is not. She will talk a big game about those values while participating in an ongoing, now in its 12th year, cover-up of CIA torture, funding Trump's concentration camps at the border, endorsing and supporting serial reauthorizations of the Patriot Act no fewer than 6 times, is supporting mass incarceration. She is absolutely out of step with the human rights principles and immigrant rights and civil rights principles that have long made San Francisco a proud beacon of inclusion to the rest of the country. And I'm gravely disappointed in our federal leadership, and I'm running to represent the city because San Francisco needs a voice in Washington. And I dare say Washington needs San Francisco to have a voice in Congress.
Yeah, I guess you're making a really good point there, because at this point, even the people in San Francisco need aid and conditioning, and they're not all hiding behind corporations. I mean, this is a direct lack of representation, and I think the crisis is really highlighting that for people, because it might normally be that everything is fine mentality, and we get used to seeing homeless people on the streets, but now they're on the edge of being homeless, and we're dealing with other states that don't have the eviction freeze, because we have pretty much a solid 100%, 1 year ban on evictions. And that is the ultimate privilege right now amongst everything going on. And I think I'm hoping that people will see these things and recognize how important it is that we need someone in Washington who's making sure that it's happening for everyone.
Just on the point about the freeze, like the eviction freezes are a great first step, but that's not enough by a long shot. We need to freeze and forgive rent payments, mortgage payments. Like until we do that, we are forcing working people to bear the worst costs of this pandemic, even when banks are better situated to do it. And I'm tired of seeing banks weaponize social and financial crises to, extract another pound of flesh from the American people. That happened in 2008, and it's happening again. And I'm not here for that. I'm here to represent we the people of the United States, and I'm eager to get our voices represented in Washington finally.
Yeah, this is a conversation we're having a lot with people, especially progressive candidates. We're talking about the conscience of the country, right? We're talking about putting, capital can't be the leading factor in what determines our decisions and, what is right and wrong. It has to be putting people first. And
That's
I don't
right.
think I can't imagine anyone that's not going to align with. You just kind of sometimes got to unwrap what those words mean to people. But, let's talk about something right now, because let's talk about what words mean to people. A particular commercial came out recently, and I'm not saying I am not. This is not an endorsement of any way of anything or in anything except whoever edited the video did a fantastic job. I think I can say that safely, right? That's not a pro, because Trump's video.
It was a brilliant job. It was a very well executed video. Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts though? I mean, that ice cream thing, it had my blood boiling.
Yeah.
And that was on the news.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many things to say here. On the one hand, just setting aside the ad to focus first on what it depicted, Speaker Nancy Pelosi is a very wealthy woman. She was born into political privilege and inherited wealth. And frankly, I don't think struggle is a thing that she's ever had to encounter in her life. And, she went to Congress as a political fundraiser. That was her qualification. And unfortunately, we see that lack of qualification demonstrated in very stark relief today. Beyond her opulence at a time that so many Americans are struggling, and the tone deaf willingness to show off her opulence. What enrages me about Nancy Pelosi is her voting record, right? supporting Trump's foreign policy, supporting his trade policy, imposing conservative fiscal austerity rules, slow walking an impeachment process and limiting it, losing a fight that we could have won if she showed up fully for executive accountability, supporting mass incarceration and CIA torture, as I was mentioning before, executive secrecy across a range of contexts. It's her voting record that aligns me against Pelosi and that drives me to the race. And as an immigrant whose family lost the home that I grew up in when I was 16 to foreclosure, I understand what struggle is. My college experience was a 10-year saga of going to school at night while I worked for a series of banks during the day before I had a chance to then study and then teach at Stanford Law School. That was 20 years ago. I've been fighting for our rights ever since, and successfully expanding the set of civil rights, even in an era of corporate rule. That entire time, I have watched Nancy Pelosi stand against our communities and stand with Wall Street. And then to show off, $20 a pint ice cream and $25,000 freezers while people are struggling to pay rent, it is at least tone deaf. Now, to see what Trump did with that, the ad that he produced this week, for me, I felt the first minute I watched it, I was just like, wow, who did this? This is amazing. And then I got to the end and my heart sank because I realized what is happening is a precise repeat of 2016, when corporate Democrats, having aligned themselves so closely with Wall Street, lost the opportunity to say to the American people, we stand with you, opening this space for a charlatan, a snake oil salesman, to come in, waving his brand around saying, I'm an outsider, I stand with you. I mean, if we look at the American political system, who is the out-of-touch millionaire who jumps to mind first? I mean, that does describe Pelosi, but it describes Trump even better. Right? They're of the same ilk. They are both inherited sons of privilege with enormous wealth and power that they didn't earn, that they are then using now to force corporate decisions on the rest of us. And that's not acceptable. It's bad for the party. It's bad for the country. And particularly the centrist moderation of the Democratic Party is responsible here because it created what we would say in cybersecurity is an attack surface for Trump. And that attack surface need not be there. If Nancy Pelosi showed up for our district, showed up for the consensus positions of the American people, bipartisan majorities favor universal health care, right? The Green New Deal is a majority position and she derides these positions. She refuses to meet the needs of the people. And that's what creates this opportunity for demagoguery. And the threat, the specter of right-wing voices claiming economic populism, that is the path to fascism. And the only people who can close it are Democrats by showing up for the needs of we, the people of the United States. That's the real anti-fascist project at the moment, is to recover a working party, a party for working people that will inoculate the American people and our country against this snake oil being peddled by the likes of our criminal president.
Yeah, I mean, can we write that down, please? That was amazing. Yes. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, no, totally. I think there's a thing going on that the Democrats, first off, they have a moral superiority problem. I'll simplify some things for people. The Democrats have a moral superiority problem, and when they're just as rich as Trump is, and Trump does not have, he's a different guy, where the Democrats will lie to their own party, the Republicans will lie to everyone. And so when you put those two people against each other, the one that lies to everyone will always win. And that's sort of the inevitable factor when you pit Pelosi against Trump and the ads we're going to see for the rest of the year. And my only fear is that it foments support for her in her district.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated juggle for someone in your position when
Very
she's
so.
been in this lockdown place for so long. Sorry, jumped into strategy mode a little bit because there is the ugly side of it. Yes, this could really help you nationally, but does it help you in your district get people to switch from Nancy to you?
I saw this dynamic in the primary where Pelosi claimed a lot of credit between the months of, say, I think it was November and March, for an impeachment process that she did everything she could not to show up for. Right, there had been no fewer than a dozen occasions over the preceding year that Nancy Pelosi affirmatively said she was not interested in impeaching this criminal president, just as she just decided and stuck to her guns 10 years ago, refusing to impeach a criminal president at the time, George W. Bush. And at the time, I said, we must impeach Trump and we must impeach him for corruption because that's the charge that will stick in the Senate because conservative voters don't like corruption any more than anybody else. In fact, the thing that they hate the most, more than anything, conservatives hate the idea of somebody taking their tax dollars and misdirecting them. And if the
It's the
impeachment
swamp. It's the
process,
swamp. It's just for the record, so everyone's listening. What he's describing is what they call the swamp, where it's like we gotta drain the swamp. So if you describe someone as being in the swamp, then they're like, "Whoa!" And that actually speaking their language. So that's please continue. I just
no, you're with it. These are Trump's own voters I'm talking about that would be outraged if the impeachment process was a recitation about how this tacky, rich tyrant is stealing from you and your family every day, every trip that he took to his golf courses, bringing the Secret Service with him, charging them $200 a night to stay in his tacky hotel rooms and fill his criminal pocket. If that was the impeachment process, that would shake loose votes in the Senate, at least potentially. Just to be clear, what Nancy Pelosi finally showed up for after a year of delay was a far cry from that. She said that the charge that would be the easiest to explain to the American people was inviting foreign interference in a US election. And I want to pause here and say a couple things. One, it should be impeachable because it is a crime. Yes, theoretically, sure. And no, for lots of reasons. A, we know that impeachment is a political process, not a legal one. And we know that Republicans are not going to be concerned about a partisan crime. She ran with the one charge that was the least likely to pass the Senate.
She didn't speak to the jury. She didn't speak to the jury because the Senate's essentially the jury on the thing. So she didn't create a case that would go to the jury that the people who are then making the decisions in their representative seat would be helping them make decisions, because we could go to the Republicans and be like, yeah, this is why we're doing this. And they'd be like, okay, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're right on this. Having been deeply embroiled in the grassroots end of trying to get different people to do different things. And when you cover COVID-19, which is what we talked about, the date between Trump was notified and first ignored was like a couple of weeks after the impeachment. So had we actually, and this is something nobody really wants to say, or maybe they're dancing around, but had we impeached him at that moment, we might have diverted a big part of this crisis.
This is Pelosi's fault too. It is absolutely true that our criminal president ducked into the punch of this pandemic by dismissing it early on, by satisfying himself with travel lockdowns instead of taking advantage of the early opportunity to mobilize test kits to ensure that people could get them, that cost would not be a barrier, that personal protective equipment would be available to frontline providers. We failed on every single one of those counts, and that failure belongs as well to Nancy Pelosi. It's not as if the path to impeach the president were that obscure. I wrote it in writing 6 months before she finally showed up for impeachment, and it was probably the most widely read thing I've ever written. The nation's leading authority on constitutional law, Lawrence Tribe is his name, he used to teach at Harvard Law School, he shared it saying, this is why and how we have to impeach the president. And she waited 6 months, showed up for a totally different approach that I warned at the time was doomed to fail. I hate being proven right by the failures of corporate Democrats. I'm so tired of it. It's been going on for 20 years. And I would rather help save my neighbors from some of these predictable pitfalls. And, she, I don't want to say inadvertently ran a weak case. It seems quite clear to me from the outside looking in, and I haven't had a chance to speak with her about this, but it's pretty clear that she proceeded with an impeachment process that was designed to fail. And the failures of this administration are also the failures of corporate Democrats, because if it weren't for Nancy Pelosi standing in the way of a real impeachment process, we would not have this criminal tyrant with his boot on our neck.
Yeah, there's really a lot to unpackage in everything you're saying. I really agree with like 99.9% of it. The whole thing about being in Congress this long and the Senate and coming from a fundraising perspective, success. Okay, so you like playing a video game. You get this like feeling, you get the one up, and it gives you this sense of completion, and you get this feeling, and you're like, yeah. And fundraising is a little like that. You get this sense of completion as you're going through fundraising. So the problem I feel like we're having with her coming from this angle of that completion is angled at like getting money or these minor steps that aren't necessarily actually real things. So they get in these habits of doing these things, or they're just evil and they're doing it all on purpose. And I'm not sure which one it is, because I totally agree with you. And this is me talking, by the way. This is not the candidate. Because the thing you're saying about seems like it's planned to fail. And I am sick of being proven right on the back end when we could have been right on the front end. And we're talking about weighing lives. And here we are. We're actually counting them at the moment.
Way that this could have been really different. I mean, just think about how different this pandemic would have been if we had universal health care. If everybody who got sick could just go to the doctor without having to worry about, there was a 17-year-old in Los Angeles who 2 weeks ago died from COVID after he was turned away from an urgent care setting because he didn't have health insurance. What sense does that make? I mean, baked into the sauce of for-profit private insurance is what amounts to fraud, right? Because the insurance companies make money because they don't pay out as much as they take in. The whole thing is based on a macro misrepresentation. And if you add up the money that people pay in their insurance premiums and their copays and their deductibles, and you put that next to zero, I want to just make clear, Medicare for All is a no-brainer policy. Not only would it have made this pandemic a lot less severe, it will make the next pandemic less severe. It will create jobs. It will improve healthcare outcomes. It will reduce costs. It will keep Americans in their homes and out of the streets. There are so many ways that simply establishing a human right to healthcare, as the rest of the industrialized world did a long time ago, would save us a great deal of misery. And that too is a failure, not exclusively of the Republican Party. That is a failure of the corporate Democratic Party that refuses to meet the needs of working people. And these are the choices that San Francisco has before it as a city. And I dare say that if our city shrugs off the yoke of the failed paradigm of the past, it will unlock a lot of opportunities, not just for our city, but I think for our country, because it is these principles that have been absent from Congress for entirely too long. I see allies in Congress having emerged in the last cycle. I'm thinking particularly of the Squad, and the Squad needs to expand into a brigade, and that's what I'm running to do.
I think that's an excellent idea. I've met a number of them, and they are fantastic individuals, amazing at their legislative work. We're hoping to talk to some people about Rashida Tlaib's Mint the Coin plan. We're hoping to talk to some people about Ilhan Omar's rent freeze plan, because both of those are pretty much they're the standard bearer for progressive policy at the moment, and not a stimulus for getting out of this, but the relief to get through this. And it's also coming out when you talk about Medicare for All that we're learning the virus is here much sooner, and possibly as far back as December. We're getting cases in San Francisco, they're confirmed weeks before when they were confirmed, like a death was confirmed there. The thing is, we would have caught this earlier. Had we had a Medicare for All system where the hospitals were all speaking to each other, not to mention we would be able to treat this more effectively, because I've been watching, we've done tons and tons of interviews with doctors and virologists, people working on serious stuff, and we see stuff we knew 2 months ago still being practiced at hospitals in Chicago, costing us lives. So when we talk about saving lives with Medicare for All, it's not just about accessible treatment, but it's a communication between the hospitals that comes from that. It's the safety protocols that are uniform between everyone. It's the saving lives of everyone in the whole process. I think that's really good stuff. But I got a question for you about this. Medicare for All. I have this theory, and I've been running this by all the candidates we interview. But the idea is that we say Medicare for All is very simple. So we think it's very brandable. But you know how the Democrats, they come out with this stuff where they think from their end. They don't think about it from the people they have to convince. Who's our jury on Medicare for All? It's the Republicans. So I'm thinking, what if we rebranded Medicare for All in conservative terms, like federal health insurance or something to that idea, just to speak to them? And I'm not saying we should do anything. I'm just trying to put this out there as a concept, because we talk about this branding issue and you brought it up. Yeah. So I'm thinking, what if we take a dose of our own medicine? Just putting that out there.
Not crazy. I mean, ultimately what we're talking about is how to package policy. And as a policy wonk, I mean, it is the policy that most interests me. The packaging, I don't want to say is arbitrary, but I think there's certainly a lot of merit to the idea of presenting a policy in terms that will resonate with the audience. I do think the Republicans are part of the obstacle to Medicare for All, but to be perfectly honest, it's corporate Democrats who are standing in the way. So I wouldn't necessarily concede that the Republicans are the problem. I mean, I think the way to present universal health care is simply, if you have a kid or a parent or a family member or a body that at some point will get sick, that can be a sickness that either threatens your house and your livelihood. It can threaten you with bankruptcy or homelessness, or it cannot. And why don't we just make a choice as a society that lets sick people get better instead of having to worry about how to keep their lights on and food on their table? And that's not rocket science. That's just basic humanity. And I think that that's a policy that sells to Republicans and Democrats alike. It's why bipartisan majorities already favor the policy, right? I actually don't think we have to convince anybody. We just have to remove the gatekeepers so that our popular consensus can find its expression in policy.
You did actually what I was suggesting, because what you just did is called kitchen table politics, economics, kitchen table economics. You broke it down to how would you discuss it at your kitchen table. And that's the talking point of the working class. How do they discuss this stuff? It doesn't matter about political party. And you really just bridged a gap right there for that. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, definitely.
You're
So
very kind.
we are gonna wrap this up, but here's the thing. You called yourself a policy wonk, and you have really, by the way, are very impressive at speaking on policy, specifically having listened to you right now. Normally, Carrie is used to me interrupting. That's why speaking in the blocks, I'm like, I got to give this guy a break. It's just amazing. I'm hoping we can get you back here to discuss policy because, I say this stuff, but people really need to hear it from somebody like yourself. They need to hear the expert break it down and have discussions because I've never heard someone break down some of these things as well as you have. I think that makes you, at people who want to say, oh, well, he's got an uphill battle. Well, they have not listened to you yet, and they need to. Because I think that, I feel like when they hear you speak about these issues, how could they not get on board with like a monthly commitment to making sure, especially when I'm sure a lot of your stuff is going into relief. So I'm hoping people watching this are going to step up and volunteer. This is an amazing candidate for everyone. I really want you to think about it. I don't want you to look at this, the monolith over here, focus on the work here, because I think you'll agree with this, that COVID-19 has changed everything.
That much is absolutely true. And we have a ton of support. You're right. I mean, I just want to acknowledge, though, the point that you raised. We do have basically the toughest target in politics. I mean, I'm going after the seat held by the most powerful corporate politician on the planet. And I'm doing that as an immigrant without a political dynasty, without a political legacy. I don't have a powerful family or anything to I don't own anything. All I have is a 20-year history of fighting for our rights in the face of a bipartisan assault that the incumbent has been a part of. And the reason I'm in this position, I'm the first Democrat that Pelosi is ever going to have had to confront in a November election. I aim to make this election her last. And the reason I'm in this position is because we have support from tens of thousands of people from every state in the union. And U.S. expats, even abroad. We got 30,000 votes a month ago, and I'm looking forward to scaling that forward in the next several months. And we have literally thousands of people making phone calls for us. So if your listeners and viewers anywhere share our concerns, we are very eager to offer an outlet for our collective outrage.
Great. We were definitely going to take your links and put them on the video. I will even personally share them around. I'm hoping that we can, get you back on here. We'll keep talking about what's going on. It's a long race till November. We can't talk about what's going to happen next week, let alone what's going to happen next month, let alone what's going to happen at the end of the year. So I assume California will have some type of election. All right, Shahid Buttar, you are an outstanding candidate. We can't endorse here at Progressive Insider, but we sure as heck can put you up. So whenever you want to come back, you want to talk to us, you want to work with us, let us know. I would really like it if you'd come on, discuss policy. That would just be exceptional. Please, everyone, if you are considering looking for a candidate to get behind, check out the links below, sign up, check it out. If you're looking where to put your monthly endorsement, this is another great candidate. He does have an uphill battle, but that's every progressive challenge. We can never look at it from the idea of a race as unwinnable, especially when we have a candidate as good as this. Sir, thank you for being here with us today.
You're so kind. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to the next chance to share views with you.
Wonderful. All right. So I am Don Ford. This has been Progressive Insider. In addition to his stuff, Carrie will kill me if I don't pitch our stuff too. We've been working really hard on our Patreon. We got our first major Patreon donor, Gene Martin. Thank you again, sir. I know he's like, how do people know my name? But we do. We know because they tell us. So we're just going to keep making these materials. We got great interviews coming out. If you haven't seen, we just did Lauren Ashcraft, not Ashcroft, because apparently today's been a day of challenging names. Lauren Ashcraft, another great candidate all the way in New York. But Shahid Buttar, this has been all about you, and thank you again for being here. So everyone who's watching us, have a great night.